So imagine like a war, right? But it's so brutal, so devastating that it wipes out like nearly 3 million people in just 3 years.
Mm.
Crazy, right?
Yeah.
And here's the thing. Most people have never even heard of it. Like, it's this forgotten tragedy. It's
Right.
the Biafran War, and it all went down in Africa in the 1960s. And that's what we're diving into today, trying to understand, like, why did this happen? How did the world react? Or did they even react? And what can we learn, from this whole messed up situation? Our guide for this deep dive is this YouTube video transcript from Histoire d'Afrique. They do some amazing stuff, really digging into African history. It's our map through all of this.
Yeah, and a map is a good way to put it because it is complex. So many factors, so many players. You're right, the Biafran War, it's often overlooked, kind of brushed under the rug of history, but it's a conflict with global implications, really. You start pulling on that thread, and it unravels a whole lot about ethnic tensions, the legacy of colonialism, the whole mess of international politics.
Yeah, totally. And the video, it starts by like setting the scene, right? So we're taking Nigeria in the 1960s. Freshly independent, which you think would be a good thing, right? But they were still dealing with all the baggage, all the leftover issues from British colonial rule.
For sure.
Like, they were left with this insanely diverse nation, over 250 ethnic groups, all kind of forced together within these borders that were drawn, not based on any cultural ties or anything, but just like colonial convenience.
And those borders, even though they seem arbitrary, they really mattered. It's like the British, whether they meant to or not, they kind of played favorites.
Oh.
Propping up certain groups, giving them more power and influence, which obviously breeds resentment down the line, right?
Totally. So you've got this powder keg of ethnic diversity, resentment simmering from colonial rule, and then bam, oil. Like, to make matters worse, they discover vast oil reserves, and guess where?
Right in the southeast.
Exactly. The region dominated by the Igbo people. Talk about adding fuel to the fire, right? It's like, was conflict inevitable at that point? I mean, come on.
It's never that simple. History is messy. But you can't deny that the discovery of oil changed everything. Suddenly, it wasn't just about cultural dominance or political power. It was about controlling this incredibly valuable resource. The stakes just got a whole lot higher.
Totally. So we've got our like recipe for disaster, right? Ethnic tensions, colonial baggage, and now everyone's scrambling for oil. But how do we go from like uneasy peace to all-out war? The video, it points out some key turning points, like the 1965 regional elections. What happened there?
Those elections were a major turning point, yeah. They kind of exposed just how fragile Nigeria's unity really was. The predominantly Hausa party, they won, which, on the surface, just politics, right? But for many Igbos, it wasn't just a political loss. It felt like a sign. Like their place in this new Nigeria, it was under threat.
And things kind of go downhill pretty quickly from there, don't they?
Yeah.
Because just a year later, in January of '66, you have a group of Igbo soldiers. And they're scared, they're worried about their safety, their future, the whole deal. And they decide to stage a coup. They overthrow the government, assassinate a bunch of key leaders, and then install General Aguiyi Ironsi, who's Igbo, as the new head of state. It's like you can feel the tension ratcheting up, even now, just talking about it.
Yeah. And it's crucial to remember that this coup, while it was Igbo soldiers behind it, it wasn't this like unified Igbo power grab. The situation was way more nuanced than that.
Yeah.
Like way more volatile. The assassinations, especially like the targeting of those northern leaders, it set off this chain reaction. You had these waves of retaliatory violence, specifically targeting Igbos living in the north. I mean, we're talking massacres, thousands killed, people fleeing for their lives back to the east. This wasn't just a political coup anymore. This was ethnic violence on a horrifying scale.
So it's just like chaos at this point. Igbos fleeing south, the country's a powder keg, and the coup, the thing that was supposed to keep them safe, just made it all 10 times worse. What happens next?
Yeah, it's like trying to put out a fire with gasoline, right?
Yeah.
The unrest doesn't stop there. So General Ironsi, right, the Igbo leader who took over after the coup, he tries to stabilize things, bring the country back together.
Right.
But his ideas about unification, like getting rid of the federal system, it just backfires. People see it as a power grab, which, let's be real, it kind of was, right?
Yeah.
And it just drives those divisions deeper. It all leads to this other counter-coup, July '66, and this time, Ironsi's assassinated.
It's like every time someone tries to fix things, it just blows up in their face.
So who steps up then? Who fills that void?
This is where Yakubu Gowon comes in. He's a Christian, important to note, but not Igbo, which in this climate is a big deal for some people.
Right. Right.
So he tries to restructure things, appease different groups, the whole bit. But the damage is done, right? That trust, it's gone. And this is where Biafra comes into the picture, yeah.
Bingo. May 30th, 1967. Big day. Emeka Ojukwu, he's the military governor of the eastern region. He's a major player in this Igbo separatist movement that's been building. And he makes a decision. He says, we're done. Declares independence for the Republic of Biafra. Just like that. A whole new nation right there, carved out of Nigeria. Looking for self-determination? Yeah, but also facing this incredibly uncertain future.
It's got to take guts to, declare independence, knowing what could happen, the bloodshed. It's heavy stuff. So what about everyone else? How'd the rest of the world react to this? Did they just sit back and watch Nigeria fall apart?
Well, this is where things get really interesting. Because it's not so straightforward. See, Britain, they're the former rulers, right?
Yeah.
Officially, they back the Nigerian government, go one side. But, and this is important, behind the scenes, whole different ballgame.
Ooh, okay. Now we're talking. Intrigue, secret deals, who's playing who. The video mentioned something about the French.
Exactly. So publicly, France, they're condemning the secession, right?
Yeah.
But secretly, they're sending support to Biafra. Weapons, supplies, the works.
No way. Why would they do that?
Lots of reasons. Part of it, yeah, it's that Cold War rivalry. Sticking it to Britain is always tempting, but it goes deeper. Remember the oil? France, they're still hurting after losing Algeria and their oil fields. So Biafra, they see an opportunity.
Makes sense. Two birds, one stone kind of deal.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Prop up Biafra, weaken their rivals, maybe get a new source of oil.
Yeah. It's a win-win. Wow. It's crazy how, what we see on the surface, it's often just the tip of the iceberg, especially when you've got powerful countries pulling the strings. But it wasn't just about weapons and money, right? The video talked about the power of narrative, and I got to hear more about that.
Oh, yeah, that's huge. See, France understood that winning battles wasn't enough. You got to win the story, win over public opinion. So they helped Ojukwu and the Biafran leaders. They helped them craft a narrative. They painted this picture of genocide against the Igbo people. And they knew exactly what they were doing, playing on those Cold War fears, the West's guilt over colonialism. It was a propaganda campaign, straight up, designed to pull at heartstrings, get people on Biafra's side, and it worked, right? I mean, you think about the images that were coming out of Biafra at the time. Starving kids, refugees everywhere, just brutal scenes. It was hard to ignore.
Yeah, those images they're unforgettable. They're like what people think of when they hear Biafra and war.
Right, but it's important to remember those images, they weren't just a side effect of the war, They were a tool. Both sides used those images to try and sway international opinion. The suffering was real, obviously, but the way it was presented, the narrative, that was all part of the fight, too.
It's sad, Even in the middle of all that pain, people were still trying to use it for their own benefit. But speaking of suffering, we got to talk about the blockade. The video, it gets into it. The devastating impact of Nigeria's decision to cut off Biafra's supplies.
Yeah, the blockade, that was just brutal. It was designed to cripple Biafra, plain and simple. And I mean, militarily, yeah, it worked. But the human cost, devastating. You're talking about a famine, a man-made famine. Hundreds of thousands of people starving to death, most of them kids. It's still one of the most controversial parts of the whole war.
Those numbers, it's hard to even fathom that many people, that much suffering. And it just makes you think, did any of it matter? Did the blockade, the famine, did that change how the international community responded?
It definitely pushed some countries and organizations to step up their aid efforts, like groups like Oxfam, MSF. They were crucial in getting food and medical supplies into Biafra. But politically, it didn't really tip the scales. The war, it just kept dragging on another 2.5 years, fueled by international interest, internal conflicts, and everyone just refusing to back down.
And in the end, Biafra they couldn't sustain it. They were cut off, out of resources. January 1970, after, almost 3 years of fighting, Ojukwu, he flees into exile, and Biafra surrenders.
We talked earlier about how this war had, global implications, but what about for Nigeria? How do you even start to rebuild a country after something like that?
Yeah.
After so much bloodshed, so much division?
Yeah, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it? The video, it talks about how Gowon, he tried to make things right, allowed Biafran soldiers back into the army, didn't put everyone on trial, which that's a start, right? But the trauma, the resentment, it doesn't just disappear overnight. And all those underlying issues, the ethnic tensions, the economic inequalities, the legacy of colonialism, that's all still there, simmering under the surface.
So where does that leave us? I mean, this was decades ago, half a world away. It can feel like ancient history,
Yeah.
but I got to think there's something we can take away from it, right? Oh, absolutely. The Biafran War, yeah, it was a specific time, a specific place. But the lessons, they're universal. It shows us what happens when you let ethnic and religious tensions fester. When powerful people exploit those divisions for their own gain, it shows how something like oil, which should be a source of prosperity, can become a weapon, a curse. And it exposes the truth about international relations, how powerful countries, they often care more about power than peace.
It's a lot, and it's heavy stuff, but it's like we have to learn from it, right? Because even though that war is over, the same things are still happening today. You see conflicts on the news, and you got to wonder, are we making the same mistakes? Are we just doomed to repeat history?
That's the question, isn't it? And hopefully, by understanding the past, by really digging into what caused things like the Biafran War, we can make better choices now.
Mhm.
Maybe, just maybe, we can keep conflicts like that in the history books where they belong.
Well said. This deep dive, it's been eye-opening for sure. And to everyone listening, I hope, this is just the beginning. Take what we've talked about, do your own research, keep asking questions. Because there are so many more stories, so many perspectives out there. It's up to us to uncover them.